there's no real reason to go outside and look out the windows. Kind of nasty, so we're better off in here. I will point out that since we first gathered this morning, if Robert Newland is to be believed, about 500 people have moved into cities. So the problem is a real one. And after looking for the sort of the bottom up and the top down, the afternoon we're now going to answer all the questions. And I can't think of a better person than we talk to Alicio Fernandez and Martin Smolka will then mess the whole thing. So, Alicio, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I feel quite comfortable presenting this PowerPoint here because it's, I think it's, to some extent, it organizes many of the things that we said before. But my main point is quite simple. I do believe that we already know a great deal about urban land regularization programs, but the fact is that we are not really paying enough attention to what we know. We are not acting upon what we know. We are not organizing our lessons and our findings in a proper way. Robert here before and Billy too, they were emphasizing how more and more informal development in the access to land and housing in urban areas has become no longer the exception but the rule. So we are talking here about something which is more and more structural and needs to be confronted as such, right? I mean, we are talking about a gigantic phenomenon which is not new. Some of the favelas, shanty towns, and cases that we know have been there for 100 years or more, and have not been regularized yet, have not been formalized, legalized, integrated into the broader urban structure yet. So this is not a new phenomenon, and it's getting worse. All the data offered here shows that it's happening not only in large cities, but more and more also in middle-sized and even small cities. I mean, a number of new forms of informal development have been identified, both in public and in private areas, with very, very serious implications I'm not going to discuss, but social, environmental, the water crisis in particular, political, economic, cultural, legal. So this is very much a process which is not only or not exactly the symptom of an urban development model. We are talking here about the model itself. This is not just a symptom of something that went wrong. This is the way cities are being produced, especially in developing countries, and more so given the higher rates of urbanization. So, but unfortunately, the centrality of this issue of informal access to land has not been properly recognized by governments or international development agencies and financial institutions. We still don't know much about the causes of this phenomenon. Most people don't fully understand the combination of factors that have been producing informality, and we still don't fully understand how informality itself is one of the underlying reasons of many other serious problems. So this is clearly one of the main challenges for policymakers globally. So I'm not going to dwell on the causes. It's only important to stress that we have a range of factors determining this growing phenomenon, from global macroeconomic causes to very local causes. And the main point I'd like to make is that although we do have a number of macro, regional causes determining this growing phenomenon, many, if not most, of the causes can be dealt with at the national and at the local levels, and this has not been done. So we do identify this lack of formal options to land and housing resulting from the nature of land, urban housing, fiscal policies prevailing in most developing countries, the dynamics of formal and informal land markets, political clientelism that feeds on keeping the same process of informal development happening and growing. Also, I think it's important to stress that the incipient tradition of planning, city planning, urban planning, that we see being formed in developing countries is extremely elitist and technocratic, does not take into account the socio-economic realities of access to land and housing. And this is complicated even further by the obsolete legal systems and judicial processes in force in most of these countries. But what I find even more important is to stress that the effects of this growing phenomenon can no longer be neglected, because there is this recurrent understanding that given the lack of formal options, informality is the one only option available to most urban poor. This may well be the truth, but this one option, this sole option, is not necessarily a good option. It's not a good option from several angles, I mean, environmentally, socially, politically, legally, but it's not, above all, it's not a cheap option. And this is one of the main myths that needs to be confronted. Informality is a very expensive process. It is expensive from the viewpoint of the cities as a whole, because cities produced informally are very costly, very expensive to manage. Regularization programs are extremely costly, extremely expensive, and informality is also very expensive from the viewpoint of the residents in informal settlements, who have to pay a fortune to have access to services, or to have dodgy legal rights, or to live in most precarious urban, environmental, and social conditions. So in the end, this is a game in which everybody loses. There are no winners here. So it's quite misleading to think of informal development as being a good phenomenon, in that it is the only option. It does generate a lot of resources, it does mobilize people, it does provide people with alternatives. But if you look at the broader picture, if you look at cities as a whole, the way the distribution of resources and responsibilities to is concerned, this is a game in which nobody wins. We need to reconsider that. So the institutional responses to this growing phenomenon have been far from ideal. Basically, what I see happening more and more is what I call a situation of 100% tolerance. It feels as if governments at all levels have simply given up in the impossibility of responding, coping, tackling, confronting the phenomenon. They simply gave up. And what we see happening is that more and more new forms of informal development have been identified in public land, private land, and this is a very dangerous situation, in that, besides all the other implications, tolerance generates rights. So maybe we tolerate it today, but in 5 years' time we'll be discussing rights. So this is a problem that we need to confront. And at all levels, I'd say that the institutional responses have not been adequate. One main problem is that of scale. Another problem has to do with the contents of the programs that have been designed to confront informal development. So, important as they are, the truth is that the UN campaign on security of tenure, the Millennium Development Goals, the national, regional, local programs, they only cover a drop in a much broader, much larger ocean of informality. And if the general rule has been not to do anything, those attempts at confronting this phenomenon have been formulated through isolated, fragmented, sectoral, marginal, underfunded, and erratic policies and programs. So this is very much what we know, especially looking at 40 years of accumulated experiences in Latin America and elsewhere. So we keep reinventing the wheel. Policymakers are not learning from these accumulated experiences. Perhaps we still don't know what should be done, but we clearly know what should not be done. Perhaps African, Asian, and transition countries should be looking harder at the Latin American experience, because this is a far more consolidated experience. I mean, regularization programs have been formulated and implemented in Latin American cities for 40 years now. So we do have enough elements to come up with some findings, some articulated conclusions, at least insofar as what should not be done. And even within the same institution, very often there is no organized know-how. If you look at the World Bank, I think it's quite an interesting example. If you go to the Latin American department and the African department or the Asian department, they deal with the same phenomenon in completely different ways. There's no organized know-how within the same institution, which means that the responses that have been given, especially now in the context of countries which are experiencing now process of higher urbanization, the responses have been fundamentally contradictory. So we need to take stock, organize our findings, organize our lessons, and move on from there. The main problems, to my mind, have been the fact that these programs, they have not confronted head-on the nature and the causes of the phenomenon of informal development. And as such, they end up generating further distortions in land and property markets, both formal and informal. They have not fully intervened in the land structure. They have not been articulated, for example, with other very significant dimensions of the overall land problem. And if you look, for example, at a country like Brazil, you look at the census, and there's this indication that we have a housing deficit estimated as 7.2 million units. We have maybe 60-70% of people living informally in urban areas. But the same census indicates that we have in the large capital cities something like 25% of vacant land provided with services by public action, vacant. We have about 5.5 million vacant properties. I'm not talking about second residences or weekend houses. I'm talking about vacant, built properties. So, the overall land context needs to be taken into account, and there is no way that remedial programs such as regularization programs can be conceived if not in association or in a combination with the overall understanding of the land problem. There are no proper policies for the utilization of public land, for example, which is quite a significant asset in many countries. There's no proper housing policies. There's this long-standing tradition of concentrating equipment and services in few areas of the cities. So as such, what we see is that conceived in such a fragmented way, isolated, marginal way, not establishing this dialogue with the overall land housing problem, regularization programs, they have not been able to break this vicious circle that has historically produced more and more informality, and as such they have failed to promote socio-spatial integration. Other problems is that traditionally these programs, they declare fantastic objectives, fantastic goals, but they do not translate these objectives into the necessary processes, mechanisms, resources, and instruments. And they are not reconciled, as I mentioned before, with the broader set of public policies, particularly land policies. And on top of that, there has been this long-standing also political utilization and manipulation of regularization processes everywhere. So after 30 years, the fact is that although there are no adequate assessments, even because there are no clear indicators. This is another problem. A lot of money has been spent in regularization programs, and there are no clear indicators so that we can assess whether or not these programs have worked. To my mind, I think we are talking here about very significant waste of limited resources. I mean, to my mind, we are talking about a 30-year fiasco in terms of a major failure of the policies that have been formulated, and very often, perhaps more often than not, the beneficiaries of these interventions have not been the urban poor. So this is a very dramatic context of 40 years of accumulated experiences in which a huge amount of money has been invested and, to a large extent, wasted because of these problems that I was talking about. So we need to learn some inevitable lessons from this accumulated experience. The first one is regularization programs take time. There are no way we can jump stages. They are costly. They are complex. It's far easier and cheaper to prevent. So I totally agree with Billy when he was saying that the big challenge is to prevent that more and more informal settlements are going to be formed. We need to do something about the ones that are there now, but we need also to focus on how to prevent the formation of new informal settlements, because tackling this problem is extremely costly, lengthy, bureaucratic, difficult, right? And also, as many people have emphasized before, there are no automatic, magic, simplistic, one-size-fits-all answers. I mean, it's a very complicated. So the best we can do is, first of all, to prevent this process from happening again and again and again. And then we'll have this discussion on what to do with the situation which is there now. So up to a few years ago, a lot of people would argue that we shouldn't do anything, that we should just leave, the situation as it is, and people would be able to, through their own survival mechanisms, they would be able to find a proper solution. But I think that not to regularize is no longer an option available to policymakers, not only because of the scale of the problem, but also because of the very serious implications we've been discussing, but also because time has passed. And this is one basic principle of law. Time abolishes rights in the same way that time generates rights. We are no longer talking about regularization programs as only an expression of the discretionary power of the public authorities. More and more, and many legal systems, national, local, international conventions have been recognizing that. We are talking also about the right people have to have in their settlements legalized, recognized somehow. So, more and more, we are not only talking about the discretionary power of the public authorities to act or not to act. We are talking about the obligation the state has to do something about informal settlements as a result of this recognition of social rights the residents have to having their situation recognized. The big question is how to proceed, how to regularize. Then how to regularize. Basically, I think that the design of the programs, the format of these programs should reflect the answers policymakers give to three main questions. The first is why regularize? The second one is what is regularization? What is a regularization program? And the third one is what for? What is this program for? And this is perhaps the most difficult bit here. It is crucial that whatever design we come up with, technical, political, social, takes into account this need for, to begin with, for the intervention to have a proper scale. Because so far, most of the interventions that we know, they cover 1% of a huge universe of similar problems. I mean, if you look at the way, for example, the Inter-American Development Bank has been working in Rio, they cover maybe 5% of the total number of existing favelas. So there's a problem of scale here. There's a problem also of how to reconcile technical criteria, institutional capacity for action, financial resources, and the nature of the rights to be recognized to the people living in informal settlement. Very often you come across fantastic regularization programs in that a lot of thought has been given to the technical design, sophisticated, concepts and all that, but because of the costs, the reach of this intervention is going to be insignificant. In the same way, sometimes the program is so complex, so sophisticated, but there's no institutional capacity for action. So we need to find a proper formula there, balancing out the scale with the technical criteria, capacity for action, financial resources available, and the nature of the rights to be recognized. Quickly on why should we be then regularizing? I think the answer to this question is going to determine how we distribute rights and responsibilities, honors and obligations. This is not at all a straightforward question. If you go, especially in the context of municipalities controlled by left of the center political parties, there is a widespread refusal of the notion that the communities, that the residents should be responsible financially for the costs of the regularization programs. So this in itself places an enormous obstacle to these programs. If you don't accept that all stakeholders in different ways, to different extents, should be involved, including through the financing processes of these programs, there's not much you can do in terms of achieving a more significant scale for your intervention. So how to rediscuss this need for the financing of the programs, to consider microcredit, the utilization of planning gains in other forms. It's a crucial discussion, but underlying that is this discussion on why regularize. In most Latin American cities, there is this, I'd say, this trend for the phenomenon to be conceived as only the responsibility of the state. Very little scope open, for example, for the Indian experience here, for community participation in Latin America is encouraged only insofar as political participation is concerned, in designing the programs, in deciding what should be done and where, and on determining the allocation of public resources. But when it comes to determining the financial responsibility of the communities for some of the costs of the programs, there's a general resistance to that. So this is a difficult discussion. What is regularization? I mean, what makes a regularization program? Again, we have a dispute of paradigms there. Basically, I think that in order to guarantee the sustainability of the public intervention through regularization programs, we should be talking about the combination of at least four main dimensions. The first one is the physical upgrading. The second one is the legalization. The third one is the formulation of socioeconomic programs to generate income and job opportunities. And the third one is also a more cultural form of dimension, so as to promote better conditions of integration of informal settlements into the urban society and structure as a whole. But the truth is that very rarely we come across a program in which these dimensions are conceived together. They tend to focus on one or the other, but they never put them all together. So the emphasis is either on the physical upgrading or on the legalization side of things, but very rarely we see the two things or the three or four things being conceived together. And what for? I mean, what are the main objectives of regularization programs? Also there is a dispute of paradigms. Basically, most programs declare that they have two main objectives. The first one is to guarantee security of tenure, and the second one is to promote socio-spatial integration of the settlements and of the communities. But the truth is that these two objectives are not the same, and they are not necessarily automatic. On the contrary, they may be exclusive of each other. You can, for example, promote security of tenure and aggravate the conditions of socio-spatial segregation. Or you can promote some level of socio-spatial integration without necessarily guaranteeing individual security of tenure. So it's difficult to find a balance there, and also how to reconcile individual interests and rights with the public interests and obligations. This is a big question, because very often, exactly because they are concerned about the fact that the actual beneficiaries of the intervention are not necessarily the urban pool, many local administrations have been trying to tie people down, to prevent them from capitalizing on their newly acquired properties. For example, preventing them from selling, selling the house and selling the houses and that. So this is not the right answer here. How to find a proper formula in which people's individual liberties and interests and rights can be fully reconciled with the broader public interests and obligations. So this leads us to this discussion which has dominated the international debate over the last 10 years or so, which is the question of the legalization of informal settlements, which is certainly important, but not for the reasons usually given. We today know for sure that titling programs, they are not an exclusive or a necessary requirement for people to invest in their houses and businesses. We just look at the Latin American cities in the photograph showed by Robert, and you see that there's a consistent level of investment in houses, informal houses and businesses, even without titles, provided that there is a social political pact which generates this perception of security. If people feel that they are no longer going to be evicted because of this prevailing pact, they do invest in their houses and businesses even without titles. We also know that titles are not no automatic guarantee that people are going to have access to credit, as the financial banking system as a whole still does not lend to the poor. Right? So, and on the other hand, we have many examples of people who don't have titles but do have access to official credit when it comes to programs sponsored by the government, enabling people to buy building materials, for example. And also, we know that titling programs, legalization, formalization programs, whatever name we give to them, have no major structural impact on poverty. Of course, they do contribute to minimizing, the precarious daily life conditions of the people living in informal settlements, which in itself is a fantastic thing, right? But they have no major impact on poverty. So this is not the main reason why we should be discussing legalization programs. We do need to discuss legalization, and I'm totally in favor of this titling dimension because, as well as providing protection against eviction, minimizing all sorts of civil law conflicts, promoting the economic realization of rights, guaranteeing some level of social political stability, allowing for increased taxation by the public authorities. The legalization programs also help to clarify legal tenure regimes, to facilitate economic investments and all that. So we have a range of reasons why we should, yes, be emphasizing the formulation and implementation of legalization programs, preferably if they are conceived together with the other dimensions, like grading, socioeconomic programs, and all that. But how to legalize? This is the big question. Again, we have to go back to those three questions. We have to remember why, what is and what for, and take this into account. I mean, very often when discussing the formulation of informal legalization programs, people think only in terms of the interest of the individual residents. I think it's also important to think of the general interests of the city, of the urban community as a whole. And the truth is, if you look at this from a broader viewpoint, you see that there's a wide range of legal political options. Individual freehold is one, a very significant one, but it's by no means the only one, right? We have individual freehold, we have collective freehold, we have individual leasehold, we have collective leasehold, we have more precarious forms of permits, licenses, authorizations, social rental contracts. So you have a range of legal political possibilities when it comes to discussing what kind of titles, what kind of rights should be recognized to people. Billy Cobbett was mentioning before the importance of earmarking land, right, for certain functions, especially housing, social housing. This is something that in Brazil the law calls the demarcation of special zones of social interest, which has been one of the most effective tools in our new planning system in order to address both existing informal settlements and also to reserve land for future developments for social housing interests. I personally don't like this notion, which is quite popular these days of a continuum of rights. So let's start with something less, significant and aim at one day giving people freehold titles. I think it's misleading in that rights are not necessarily better than others. They are different. And also there's no necessary or automatic progression from one kind of right to another one. So you don't start with a form of leasehold and one day, it becomes a form of freehold. These are different responses to different needs, to different situations. What I think what I think is to finish here, what I think is crucial in this discussion concerning the legal rights involved is that there is no way we can tackle the scale of this growing phenomenon of informal development only through individual ownership. That's impossible. I mean, so Billy was saying that it's impossible. There is no way we can be just issuing titles by the second. This is not going to solve the problem. And there's no reason for that. Because if you look back at what the state's legal obligation resulting from international conventions, national constitutions, national laws, and even local laws is about, the state's legal obligation is to provide adequate housing, adequate recognition of the social rights to housing. This is not at all the same as saying that the state has to provide ownership, let alone individual ownership. So providing individual ownership may well be the best way to materialize this legal obligation to recognize social housing rights, but not necessarily the only one. And especially when it comes to settlements on public land, perhaps this is not even the best option. Perhaps you have other legal political choices which are more conducive to this idea of promoting social spatial integration. And also we do need to consider collective legal solutions in the same way that planners and policymakers accept that we have to deal with collective technical solutions when it comes to access to water, to electricity, or to sewage. Also, when it comes to rights and land rights, we do need to consider cooperatives, condominiums, and all sorts of collective rights and titles. So, to sum up, basically, what I'm calling here is for this urgent need for us to give integrated and articulated responses to this growing and very serious phenomenon. I mean, without other policies and programs, individual security may well be assured. I mean, we by giving titles, for example, individual titles to people, we may well be, making sure that individually they'll be protected against eviction, but that does not necessarily lead to the promotion of social spatial integration of the communities and of the areas. On the contrary, what we see happening is that when there's this dissociation between public policies, very often, as has happened in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in many other countries, we see what has been called expulsion by the markets or by other forces. I mean, speculators, drug dealers, capitalizing upon this enormous investment of public money through regularization programs. So yet again, the beneficiaries of this intervention are not going to be the people who live in this area, who be expelled by gentrification processes and all that. So we do need to reconcile regularization programs with land programs, urban programs, housing programs, fiscal policies. Many bottlenecks have been identified in literature: the lack of information, outdated, land cadastres, registration, which is a main problem in many places, the way the judiciary works and all that. Another huge problem is the day after of the regularization programs, because basically what we see happening is that in those very few programs in which, you can say, it's been regularized, the following day the state apparatus disappears entirely. There's no follow-up and no continued state presence in this area. So, give it 6 months and the area is back to all sorts of informal transactions and informal, mechanisms there. So we are talking here about this urgent need for pacts to be formed. I mean, if this question of access to land and housing in urban areas cannot be left to market forces alone, it cannot be left to the state alone either. So we are talking here about this urgent need for national, truly public policies to be formulated. Again, even if in many, many legal systems the legal power to do so is given to the local governments, there's no way the best local government can cope with, this enormous problem, if not in a very significant context of intergovernmental articulation, in which we need also to involve all other sectors and stakeholders with a very clear support from international development agencies and financial institutions, intergovernmental articulation, and a very strong participation from the private, community, voluntary, and academia sectors. I mean, we are talking here about this urgent need for all these sectors to come together. But basically, what I think is the greatest contribution that we as academics or policymakers could be making here is to provide a conceptual framework which is clearly defined, and we have conditions for that. We need to get this legal, institutional, political framework right. Of course, you see, it's going to be adapted to each existing situation and all that, but we do have enough elements after 40 years of failed, attempts at intervening in this problem to come up with a general, properly defined, articulated framework that is going to enable governments at all levels, the communities involved, and the other stakeholders in the formulation and action, which hopefully will be more successful and more sustainable in the near future.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. I would say that if you have something that you don't like about someone, ask that person to speak after lunch, right? So it's terrible. But so I hope you still can support another presentation. Thank you very much first for the invitation to be here and to be in this such a interesting group of people in discussion. Let me start saying. Let me say that to the start, to the beginning, from the beginning, that I think there is one word missing in the call for this seminar, and this is access to urban land. I think access to land is not an issue. Access to service land is the issue. So I'm going to be focusing mostly into that topic. As you would see, I would reiterate much of what has been said so far, and I think many of the points that I wanted to make had been made already. So sorry if I repeat, and I'm learning a lot also from colleagues from different meetings. So we end up actually even using the same jargon many times, certain words that you're going to identify as being the same. The other thing also, I likely maybe a little bit controversial certain topic, and this is purposefully so for the discussion. So I apologize from the beginning, and I would like also to recognize two issues that were raised in the morning that has a lot to do with what we may be talking here. One is a comment that Bill made about land being good business, and this is pretty much in the agenda, pretty much in the if we want to understand why the issue is being so persistently and so the magnitude it has reached, has a lot to do with the fact that land is still a very good business for many. And the second one, the point that Bob made also about the importance of financing and the fiscal, looking at the fiscal side of that. And so I will be talking about these issues. So I just wanted to make a bridge on the with what we have talked in the morning. And finally, I would like to say also that most of my comments have more to do with Latin America than the rest of the other parts of the world. I claim no knowledge at all of what's going on in India or in many parts of Africa or Asia in general. I will be referring mostly to Latin America. Okay, so to start with, I'm suggesting that the market is probably not doing such a good job in conveying the sufficient supply of service land for the urban poor at affordable prices. This has been an issue that is very persistent, and I think there is most of our countries in Latin America, there is a structural incapacity of markets to apparently to do that. On the other hand, public policy also has not been able to, through regularization programs in particular, and then other subsidy programs, have also seemed to be quite short-legged in addressing the problem. So it's not for a surprise that, and this point has been reiterated, made many times already in this workshop, and so that the magnitude and persistence of or even an expansion that has been noted already, of informality has to do a lot with that. So the points that I would like to make, I would like to cover three issues. First, we're definitely losing ground. Informality is growing much faster than the urban population in general, and urban poverty for that matter. So it's an issue that is way beyond the issue of poverty, and I would dare saying that. Second thing, I think we have to revisit and many of my predecessors, particularly the Adhere now, has made a big point on the need to revisit regularization programs, and Bill already laid down the magic word of the need to be preventive. I think that this is a critical issue that we should focus or should put our attention to. Not only the regularization programs have not been resolving the issues, but I would go one step further. I think in many cases it's actually contributing to the problem. It's actually aggravating the problem, and that's the sad story behind it. And most of these policies that have been put forth so far have kept the rules of the game of urban land markets basically untouched. There's certain issues are simply sacralized, or it's completely untouched, and it's very hard to propose something with some consequence if we're not willing to change certain basic things that are in the very nature of the causality of the problem that we're trying to deal with. So the third thing, the third point, just so not to be on the negative only side of it, and I'm not, and there is, although I will be talking about perhaps a third path or something like of that kind. It's not as you're saying, a silver bullet or any panacea or anything like that. I have no claim whatsoever for that. But there are some experiments being done with certain change of the way things are being done that may look promising, may suggest some interesting avenues of directions to think about. And so we're talking here going beyond the subsidy or the 100% tolerance model that Adhere already mentioned. These are the two basic models that prevail in most policies that we're following in most countries. And I will make a brief comments on two experiments that are being done that trying to break, that is a sort of a break on vis-a-vis these two models. That is the USMI project in Colombia and the social urbanizer in Porto Alegre. Okay, I'm going to go fast on that because I think some of these numbers you people already know quite extensive, so that we don't need to waste money. Oh, money, time, both. But anyway, informalities are growing much faster than population, and I'm taking here Peru because Peru is such a showcase in many ways. And Peru has been showing, in spite of these 40 years of regularization programs, that the informality has been growing at a very, very fast pace, even in the last years when you had this enormous program for regularization by COFOPRI. So there is significant increase in the last decade in spite of the regularization program. So these may be interesting signals of something going on there, right? It's beyond poverty. There are non-poor living. I think these 2 points have been made already. There are many non-poors living in favelas or in informal areas, and this has been being shown over and over in surveys being done in these areas. And something like, even in Rio de Janeiro, 3% of the families earning more than 10 minimum wage. 10 minimum wage is beyond it. This is upper middle class in Brazilian standards. Rents in certain areas easily cover cost one minimum wage easily. Poor in non-informal areas, 64%. I'm just quoting here some information from Rio de Janeiro, and I can bet that in other places that something like of that sort may be happening as well. 64% of the poor living outside of favelas, and so it's not. We're not talking about this. Although we tend to connect or informality to poverty, it's not such as simple as that. I think we have to think a little bit more carefully about that, because there is a lot of issue there that has nothing to do with poverty and vice versa, right? Causes of informality, Adhere has covered most of them, and this is perhaps a different classification, but basically the conventional one, it's easier to say, well, this is an issue of poverty. Well, by the way, this is the idea of saying that blaming on poverty the issue of informality is also one very convenient way, like for local officials to take out the responsibility of dealing with the issue. Well, poverty is a problem in the city, it's not a problem of the city. So this is something that has to do with employment, with income policy. This is defined at the macro level. So this is a problem that someone dropped in my city. It's not something that I can deal with that. So it's convenient to deal with that. But as we can see, shall see that the informality is an issue that goes way beyond the issue of poverty. It has to do with land markets. Well, the second issue, the conventional argument for that, has to do with the excessive regulation, hard to comply, now the impact that it has on prices and things like that. This is a quite known argument as well. Absence of social programs, I think Adhere covered that part already quite extensively. But there is another one that I would like to add to that, to the list, and that is that informality itself is becoming an issue, a cause of informality. Informality begets informality. And then there are many ways of how this vicious cycle is how this feedback is happening. One of them has to do with the profitability of agents. It's much more profitable to operate in an informal market in urban periphery. This has been shown over and over again also. There is even some signals given from these curative regularization programs, as I will suggest later, that is actually giving the wrong signals. It's actually being reiterated, this saying it's, well, just occupy, don't worry, sometime, and in the future someone is going to come in, and it becomes a part of an industry. In Mexico, they call it la industria del precarismo, right? This is this kind of how people learn how to operate a machine or to milk the cow there. But the main cause of informality, I would suggest that it has to do with the high prices of service land and this issue of the insufficient supply of service land at affordable prices. And this is of course takes the topic much further away into the land markets policy or land policies. Let's revisit quickly the regularization programs. Let me start from the beginning, saying that as Adhere has pointed already, and that not regularizing is not a political option. The problem is there, and we don't have the political option of not doing anything with that. For social humanitarian reasons, for the negative externalities that also are present there, for issues of urban violence, health, epidemics, aesthetic regions, if you want. The existing structures are there, the investment is already there, the convenience, cheaper. Some people would argue that it's cheaper than new developments. I would question that. But well, we may want to revisit some of these costs. The housing is pretty bad. Most self-producers are inappropriate for living. The densities are much too high, and the densities are going really very high nowadays. The hidden operation and maintenance costs and services and infrastructure of so-called alternative solutions are also being shown quite high. There is an issue of a number of alternatives of costs of not having mails or condominium sewages or garbage collection, these issues. Issues of inadequate location. Many of these areas are not, they should never been occupied in the first place. There are environmental risky areas, and this is one of the reasons why they have been occupied in the first place, by the way. So there is a number of unanticipated effects there. Titling. When we talk about when we talk about regularization, we're basically referring to two things, and there are other dimensions to that also, but I'm referring only to two main components. One is the titling thing, and the other one is the upgrading component of it. Well, titling has been shown that it has not been doing the trick, apparently. The access to credit is more limited than people expected it would be. I think I'm just taking again a recent work by Rio Frio, Gustavo, in Peru, about 3.93% of the 1,300,000 so many duly registered plots received a loan, and that loan is of average $5,000 that has a guarantee the full value of the house of the person. It's low priority. If you ask people in surveys in most of these areas, if you have security of tenure of some kind of security already along the lines that Adhere has said, it's very low priority. There's a number of things before and then that list that has to be provided. It has been shown also that giving a title, at best, you get something like 20% on the value of your property as a consequence of that. The market does not sanction that far, as much as people would expect the value of the property. And there has been some suggestions in certain cases also that giving a title has actually stimulated more informality, particularly when it's granted before the area is being upgraded or being improved, because it may simply increase the transaction costs of these so-called substandard formal land that result from titling. If we look at these areas as a sort of a vacancy chain process, or it is part of a process, people normally, when they come to the city, they don't come to a city and to a place and stay. They move in different. There is a intense mobility within these areas, and because of that, titling certain areas that are not adequate ends up being counterproductive. Upgrading also has a number of problems and provides wrong signals for updating prices. This has been shown also that subdividers charging a premium according to the expectation the public may have, and coming to the public coming to fix it. So this is the higher the expectation that if you occupy something that doesn't have the services that it will be serviced later, the higher the price you can collect from the buyer. So as you know, land markets, the main fuel or the main ingredient of land prices is expectations. Expectation is the fuel of land prices. Opportunity costs, I think that this has been said here already, but there are the curative programs. If you look at, you compare to preventive and curative, and the differences are quite big. In Colombia, a study there showing that's 2.7 times to repair than to provide new service land or urbanize new areas. Guarapiranga in São Paulo, it's $153 per square meter. This is a huge number. The average cost of these regularization programs have been between $40 and $70 per square meter. it's quite big, these numbers of most of these regularization programs, particularly if you compare with the cost of providing new service land. That is between fully serviced between 30. I'm being extremely conservative and quite wide here, between $15 and $35 a square meter. So. Okay. There's another issue about regularization programs attracting immigration. There has been some interesting studies on showing the date when people come into many of these areas that are being object of upgrading, and showing the sort of almost a coincidence of after these the time when these areas are upgraded, that there is a peak in the incoming of occupants for these areas. And the day after, as you also refer to this name, what happens after that? First of all, the sanctioning of the market for the upgrading of these areas are not as big as people would expect. In most of these areas, I'm using the data from the Favela Bayou project. It's pretty low compared with what you would get in new areas, for instance. And I think the worst of all is that even, and this has been shown also, that areas that have been regularized after 15 years, they still have the same stigma of being a irregular place. As you know, in Rio de Janeiro, you got to the point where you can rent an address, because if you go to apply for a job and you declare that you live in Jacarezinho or Rocinha, they simply won't get you. You won't get the job. So you see that the strength of the stigma that living in certain areas would give. So regularization programs simply does not necessarily contribute to a price reduction in general. Much of the country improve the capacity of the does not improve the capacity of the public administration to provide service land. Actually, it's reducing the capacity comparing with these when you compare prices. It's a disincentive to additional land occupations. Does not contribute to that. It does not contribute to the disincentive. Sorry, it's a double negative. And does not capitalize the residential beneficiaries on that. So. We need to look to beyond that programs as we're doing so far. Let's revisit some of these arguments that are behind these programs. The conventional wisdom are based on three basic tenets here, right? One is that people are poor and cannot pay for the urbanization. Well, if you look more carefully and what's happening in most peripheries of the cities, or the prices people are paying when to actually buy a property, even in the areas that have been consolidated already, they're already paying. They're already paying. When you pay a pirate subdivider, a premium on that land, to pay $20 a square meter you're already paying what for the expectation of something that you're going to get in the future. So in fact, it's not that you don't have the capacity to pay. You're already paying for that. And I think that has been said that already. There's already mentioned that the cost of being informal is pretty high also, and that there's a lot of embedded costs there that is normally not considered. Need to subsidize urbanization for the poor. Yeah, we know that subsidies are always needed to some extent. But most subsidies models already has a big increase from the beginning, plus $21 for full infrastructure, plus the markup or whatever you have there, and you end up with something like $55. This is what the private developers are willing to do in the urban peripheries. The USME project it's dealing with 48% of the area, $2 for the land, buying land from them. In the case, I don't know if I have the time. How am I doing? 10 minutes? Okay, I may be able then to explain some. When I'm referring here to sanctioning, in the case of Colombia, the new law has a very interesting disposition there that that allows the public to buy land at prices not contaminated by the project that they're proposing the project for. In other words, when the public goes to buy land, it buys lands at a price before the project is announced, and that is a very minimal, simple thing in the law, but has an enormous impact. And these are the prices that are being used as a sanctioning to negotiate with the agricultural agricultural or regional rural owners for that land. So you could either, in the case of Uzmi, basically the deal that is proposed, you can either sell the land, and this is the rule that we're going to use, and actually they're willing to pay much more, or else you can join the trust for the redevelopment of that area and share in some of the land value increments that the plusvalias, as we call it, that the project generates. So that these are the two options that you offer to the regional landowners. Then you put the infrastructure, limit size, and this is the markup that you divide, and you get the idea of these two projects, the Uzmi and Social Urbanized, is to produce service land at a price that is competitive to the informal, of the land that is of the price of the land that is provided by the informal subdivider, the so-called pirate subdividers. And the social urbanized, you negotiate that. There is some more flexible infrastructure. I can, if I have time, I'll explain a little bit more. And the price goes a little bit higher. So these two experiments use a number of tools. The tools have to do with the land acquisition mechanism, what kind of instrument you use. As I mentioned, that's non-contaminated prices. Value capture, the mobilization, or what we call the mobilization of land value increments from rural to urban conversion. I don't know if you have an idea of you have come across with some of these numbers. They're staggering. For instance, the numbers that we've been collecting throughout Latin America about when you convert rural land to urban land, it's about 300%. That's the average. The base is very small. This means by simply signing a piece of paper saying that this land is already designated for urban use, with that you give to the owner 300% raise on that price. Just when you sell building rights, for instance, this meaning you go from a FAR of 1 to 2 or something like that, the typical appreciation between 70 to 120%. So it's I'm taking some rough numbers that we've been getting from some of these studies that are being done, particularly in Colombia and in São Paulo, with this data, with this kind of instrument. Urban infrastructure provision. This is as you know, when you pave a street or when you introduce some services, the land prices are normally the land price. Or the increase in value of the land as a result of providing some infrastructure. Normally, the value of the land affected by the infrastructure is much higher than the cost of the investment itself. This, by the way, there's a study that was done even by a World Bank consultant. What's his name? Huh? No, the guy from California. David? No. The name will come. There's someone, and he was referring to the anomaly or they said, well, why is that? This was his question. Why is it so hard to finance urban investments in infrastructure that increase the value of land much higher than the cost of the investment itself? And this has been, and one of the reasons why it's so difficult to do that is because people say, well, I may have now a land that is pretty valuable, but I'm not realizing the value because I'm not transacting. So only when I sell, I will realize, and then I could pay. Well, there are a number of schemes of how you could do this deferred payment and this kind of stuff. Land readjustment is another component being used, and this is being used extensively in Colombia nowadays. And most of these so-called partial plans are based on this scheme. Land readjustment, as I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. This is an instrument that has been widely used in Asia, and actually the origin of that was in Germany, and in Spain also used since the 19th century. Actually, Washington was produced under a land readjustment scheme, as you know, and so it's quite known. It's basically what you do is you take all the landowners of a area that is being serviced or being benefited by some kind of investment, and once the whole you reparcel the properties, but each landowner contributed with a share of the land in kind for that land resulting from this collection of the beneficiaries, landowners pay for the investment itself of the infrastructure. Japan has been using this extensively. Just to give an example, Nagoya, that was completely destroyed after the Second War. 90% of the new investment that is done in infrastructure has been done through this system there. Just to give an example. Urban operations, it's a special zoning. This has been used in many ways, in many forms. Special regulations for designated areas, direct negotiations with the subdividers, and this is a novelty to some extent. The idea that the public negotiates with the private subdividers and try to bring them to operate under formal conditions. And last but not least, public-private partnerships, and they oh shoot, for some reason I skipped. Oh, here it is. Public comes with the urban norms and regulations that are more flexible. They speed up the licensing process. You know, the licensing process, the time of licensing a subdivision is amazing. Even in Porto Alegre, it's considered to be one of the well-run cities. To approve a new subdivision, the urban peripheries would take between 12. During the last administration, between 2 and 5 years for one subdivision. So just imagine the cost for the subdivider of waiting for this time. Reducing the legal requirements, recognize a progressive step-by-step urbanization, transfer of development rights. This is another scheme that is being used. Access to specific credit lines. All these are part of this negotiation, what the public can offer in this partnership with the privates. And the private subdivider, on the other hand, share the land value increment resulting in that process. And lowers, there is some arrangement, some commitment to lower the land price for low-income buyers. And the way it's, for some reason this thing is pretty unstable. Okay, well, basically what we're talking about here is sharing land value increments between the government, occupants, and subdividers, and cost reduction from the predictability of the process, because you're sort of registering, cadastering or registering all the qualified occupants from these areas, predefined beneficiaries, and you establish the subdividers can work in a more predictable environment, and there is a number of economies of scale, because you were talking about big operations. Just to give an example, the Uzmi operation is something like 900,000 hectares. It's building houses about 62,000 houses in that area. It's almost a city. Well. The recognition of the significant land value increment generated in the process of urbanization, that the cost of curative is higher than the preventive, and then being informed is expensive for society and the occupants, something that Adhere has already shown. If we had time, I could go and show you this. Could I?
Yes. Very quick.
Then if you read fast, I'll wait for half an hour, don't speak. And so you can read whatever you want, and I'll go for the second one and then close, just to close. And this is just comparing these three models, how how they fare with each other. Well, basically, so what is this? This system here is for some reason, I don't know what's going on here. Huh? It's keeping at the end of it. Okay, so just the concluding slide. So, current policy is not sufficient. Just to bring this, informality has to do with the functioning of urban land markets, and there is a need to change the rules of the game, of the property, how the property market operates, and there are existing latent resources available. Sorry, I'm sorry if I went a little bit too fast, and I just wanted to do a small counterpoint to some of the things that have been discussed, and just to put something on the table that we could talk about. So thank you very much for your attention, and if we have some questions.
Thank you. We have 15 minutes or so. If we have a little bit more time, if people want to have a extended discussion, or we can begin to close up. It is after lunch, and it does get warm in here, so let me just open it up and see if there are questions, comments, observations. Right here, yes.
Can you talk a little bit more specifically about maybe in your mind? Can you talk more specifically in your mind? What are maybe the top 2 or 3 from your perspective, latent resources in the informal communities that are going to be critical to getting to functional urbanization?
Let me clarify first. One thing is to talk about consolidated areas. The other thing is areas that are where you're providing on the preventive side. I mean, you're providing an option, an alternative for people to occupy, right? Instead of going informal, where you would have an option. What are the latent resources? Part of that is the land value increment that results from the urbanization process itself. We talk about, if you look at the price, look at the price of the land, that the rural land, the acquisition price for that. Look at the price, the cost of providing the service, and then compare with the price that you fetch in the market. There is still a substantive margin there that you can that margin normally it's covered by what are some of the costs that the informal subdivider has to incur that you may be saving. For instance, the informal subdivider normally they don't sell. They have to break even selling 20-30% of the lots. The rest, forget about. They're not gonna recover them. So there is a big cost on that. The former subdivider, for instance, if you have to wait 3 or 4 years to get the area cleared for development, you have to protect that area. You have to put some fiscalization there. So there are a number of. This is the point. Perhaps is that the way we're doing things is a lose-lose situation. And then what are some of the margin that we may have there that we could rearrange that where we can create some kind of win-win type situation. One of them is the land value increment that result from the process itself. Now, how do you make it liquid? Well, there is part of that. There is a substantive market, people who are eager to buy this land. Service land. If you give them an option, people don't occupy an informal area because they're going to beat the system or something like that. Because they have no other option. If you offer the option, they will go for that and they will pay for that. Let me show you. Give you another example for the consolidated areas. If you invest in a slum and you title that, and you now collect your property taxes there as you collect in other parts. You know how much would the property tax, the value of the capitalized value of the property tax that you would be collecting from that area that you didn't, would represent as a component of the cost of the of the upgrading of the area from 30 to 40%, easily on that. and then you can work out the numbers, even with very, very conservative numbers that you use. So there are a number of possibilities that you haven't explored. I would say normally the local administrations are wasting resources when the local administration give up building rights and don't collect anything from that. It's giving up part of the resources they have, right? When as I was suggesting, designate a certain area that was of rural use, now that it will be put to urban use, or even when you decide where you're going to spend, when you simply say, well, the city is going to spend it in that direction and not in that direction, that gives, for these people located in that area, a benefit much higher than the other way. These are resources that are being given away, right? I'm sorry if I'm using a mundane example.
Okay, we have two questions over here. We'll go to Bob first and then this gentleman. Let me just get a sense of the room. After these two comments, are there other people who are going to... Okay, why don't we take these two comments, come to the panel, and then we'll give that gentleman the last question. Go ahead, Bob.
Just a couple of comments on DCO's presentation. Both presentations are very nice. Thank you. Two little points and one kind of rhetorical point, maybe. You're describing it as a game that everybody loses on. I would say people don't play games that everybody loses. People walk away from those games, and this will come back to my last point. I understand what you're saying, but let me come back to the last point. And then the second point was just a quibble, if you will, that in terms of, you say the World Bank doesn't have a particular policy across the different regions. And in some sense, that makes perfect sense to me. There's tribal issues in Africa, there's Latin America, very different issues, and former Soviet Union again, and South Asia has almost colonial issues. So, or in East Asia, then Chinese have it. There's to try to have a one-size-fits-all, it wouldn't be appropriate. So there's some sense of trying to do principles, as I was saying in my talk, and even that's difficult to do. But then I guess the last point, and it comes into the does everybody lose sort of game. In Billy's presentation, he talked about more urbanization means less poverty, and in particular, he's pushing that in Africa. In the study we did of the bank's shelter lending, and we've done $16 billion in shelter lending, one of the points we emphasize is that, in fact, in terms of the evaluations, this is one of the best performing sectors in the bank. It was 83% satisfactory by independent evaluations. And so, everyone's entitled to their own rhetorical interpretation of events and so forth. But, if I went into a finance minister and said what you said, this is extremely complicated. It's going to take a very long time. It's very costly. Everything has failed. I know what his answer is going to be. It's thank you very much, and we'll see you sometime in the next generation or so. So, and you, of course, again, your interpretation, I could see why you have that interpretation, but the other interpretation is one that, without lying, there are a lot of good things have happened. And so I get to the point of, maybe it's a lose-lose proposition in terms of the regularization, but Billy's point is also very forcefully right. People are coming to cities, and it's making them richer, and it's addressing the poverty problem. And so there's a win there, and there's a big win. It may not be in the sense that you were talking about it, but I guess I would urge you, as academics, not to be so bleak that you cut off the policymakers who want to do these things and just think that it's so difficult that, the story you told was, if I were the policymaker, I'd say goodbye. It's just too hard. And so it's a very good story. It's just, from my impression, a little bleak.
I just want to follow up on that because it concurs very much with what I thought. I didn't disagree. I also enjoyed the two presentations, didn't disagree with a lot that was in there. But I thought that at SU in particular, it was a pretty bleak and pessimistic, story. And when you think about it, just as Martin's presentation has shown us, we've come a long way. Regularization is here to stay. Whether it's, we shouldn't see it as the only solution. We've been talking about that throughout the day. But regularization is going to be a part of the policy panoply and will continue. It's improved dramatically. I mean, when I look at regularization policies 25, 30 years ago, they were inefficient, they were expensive, they were ineptly articulated, they were highly politicized, they were highly clientelistic. And I think that the regularization policies, whether you're talking about land entitlement or infrastructural upgrading, today are much better run. I mean, their unit costs are down. They're, as I say, they're less politicized. They're more efficient, and so on and so forth. One of the reasons why there's been so much focus on titling versus infrastructure, of course, is because infrastructure is a lumpy, costly item, whereas titling is can be promoted at minimal cost. There are costs associated with it, but if you look at the way those costs have changed over the years, it's become less and less expensive to provide titles. Or put another way, it's become much easier to put titles, to provide titles. So what I'm saying is, I think that I think your story is a little bit of a negative one, particularly if you look at it in the longue durée of 20 years, 30 years of regularization experiences and policy making. And that's really, I want to go with my comment, because today's discussion, we've really been kind of unigenerational. We've been thinking in terms of a single policy, a single generation of policies. Whereas we've started our discussions today talking about 30 to 40 years of rapid urbanization, of irregular settlement development. We've had 20, 25 years of regularization policies. So what that means is so this transgenerational dimension opens up two elements, key elements in terms of access to land. The first is the fact that parcels of land are now being transferred in the marketplace. Those lots that were acquired 20, 30 years ago are potentially in the market in terms of being transferred. The research that we're finding suggests that the capacity of the market to transfer those lots, or for people to realize the economic values of their lots, is actually extremely stunted. There isn't a sort of sub-market to purchase those. So in Alan Gilbert's terms, a home is forever. You acquire your lot 30 years ago, it's actually very, very difficult to do anything in terms of commercializing or selling that lot if you wish to do so. So the first issue is that this asset that is being created is to what extent is it feasible to transfer that asset. The second issue I want to look at is that if you take a transgenerational perspective, that implies that there are now second and third generations. The people who acquired these lots 30, 40 years ago, they may still live there. More likely, it's their kinsmen, their sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters are now living on those lots. So what you have is a dynamic on lots of subsequent generations. The question really then becomes is how are those second and third generations accessing land? How are they accessing housing? And we don't really look in great detail at second and third generation households. We know that some of them most of them want to stay local. They don't want to do what their parents did and move out to the boonies and start the whole process again. They move into rental, or depending on the size of the lot, they will share that lot. And so what that brings me to, in terms of a transgenerational, is the idea of a re-regularization process. Because we're talking about settlements in many of these cities that began 20, 30 years ago. They're now part of the intermediate ring of these cities. They're now consolidated. They're 1-, 2-story buildings, the sort of dwellings we saw in the Getchakondu this morning. They're now fully serviced. But they're now also intensely dilapidated, very high densities, intensely dilapidated, with perhaps shared among brothers and sisters with their own children. Stakeholders on that lot, but stakeholders without title or who have high insecurity, because when mother dies or father dies, who's going to inherit that lot? And so what you're now looking at is essentially even though that lot was regularized 20 years ago, even though that lot has services, even though that lot has the original owner has the title, you now have a high level of insecurity associated with the stakeholders living on that lot, first. And secondly, you have a high level of urban infrastructure dilapidation, so that the re-regularization you're requiring is not only necessarily of title or of providing security to stakeholders, but you're having to think about, or potentially we're going to have to start thinking about regularization of infrastructure, how you go about refitting the infrastructure that exists in these old, dilapidated areas. And the point is, I mean, our focus is always on the periphery and in dealing with the recently developed settlements and the settlements to come. What I'm arguing is that we're going to have to start thinking very seriously about the existing stock of irregular settlements that began and have consolidated successfully but are now on the downturn.
Okay, Adhere, I think I'll give you a chance to respond. Martine, if you want to jump in, and then we'll have the final two questions. So we'll go for about another 10 or 15 minutes. So go ahead, Adhere.
Well, thank you for...
Donald Shoup. Shoup, do you remember that? Donald Shoup?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, he's the guy. Sorry.
Thank you for your comments. I mean, it's not that we disagree. It's a question of emphasis, and also it's a question of who I'm talking to here, basically. I mean, I wouldn't say the same things if I were in your position talking to, a policymaker or a public administrator somewhere. Of course, you have to tell different stories. But having said that, my main point is depends very much on how you look at things. If you look at the numbers involved, at the scale of the problem, of all the indicators we have, and compare that to whatever has been done in terms of actual interventions through programs and that, the gap is enormous. This is the first thing. You know, the amount of public intervention to deal with this growing phenomenon is next to nothing, basically. And that one problem is scale. The other problem is contents. Even if I accept, some programs are much better now than they used to be 20 years ago. Again, they reach what? 1% of the universe of, similar situations. And again, exactly because they get better in terms of the technical approaches or the technical design, they take less into account the financial resources available, the institutional capacity for action. Look at Porto Alegre. It's continuously, this is another problem because, we don't have enough conditions to make assessments because no indicators are there, and also because there's this lack of continuity in the programs. But if you look at the municipalities in which programs have been implemented over 15 years, so you have enough elements there. Porto Alegre acknowledged that 17 years later, about 1% of the total population living in informal settlements would have been somehow improved in that they wouldn't no longer be considered residents in informal settlement. This is nothing. 1% over 17 years of continuous investment. Right. You see, so this is why I think we should rethink the whole way we've been conceiving this program. So a much more positive story would be to try and reconcile these specific policies concerning de facto consolidated situations with a broader set of public policies, land policies, fiscal policies, housing policies, this sectoral fragmented approach. I think it leads to, dead-end roads, basically. It's and they don't really, as Martin was saying, they don't really, even in terms of those privileged, settlements that have received the public intervention, they don't significantly change things in terms of course. You have a number of positive outcomes there, but there's a lot of mobility, there's a lot of gentrification, there's a lot of, in 5 years' time, in many settlements, the infrastructure is obsolete because more people come to live in those areas. 6 months later, whatever has been regularized is again informal. All the transactions are informal. People have been building new floors or new stories. You see what I mean? So there's no end to this process. Right? Insofar as the bank is concerned, I mean, I do agree that there's no general solution. But that said, I can't accept that we know nothing. We know a lot. You see, I went to the African department not long ago, and the head of the department said, I've just received the largest donation ever of the history of the bank from the Norwegian government, and I have to invest this money in regularization programs in Africa, and I don't know where to start. That I can't accept. You see that, as I said before, maybe we still don't know what to do, but I do know a lot of things that should not be done. Right? So you see what I mean? So it's not that I'm looking for a one-size-fits-all formula, but I'm looking for some kind of organized understanding of all the findings and conclusions and data, and you see that we do have available. You see, so I think it's more a question of taking a stand and saying, listen, this doesn't work, so let's try another path. Let's see if we do this, and that, perhaps. So this is a more constructive way of approach, and then investing in a formula that over 40 years, has not had a significant impact and has generated perhaps more distortions than actual positive outcomes.
Martin, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure, a quick one. I think that we have learned also that, and I think this is a United Nations Habitat actually has put this quite clear, the idea that titling should be something after a settlement has been proved to be feasible, viable. It's like, and so it's part of a process, not in the beginning. This isn't so once that thing is feasible and viable, whatever, and has shown that the community is organized. The community has also shown concern about the development of that area. Then the title may be part of a process, and even that is a process, right? But the thing is that what troubles me a little bit about this whole discussion is that if we try to think outside, we are visionaries, we are abstract, we are utopic. On the other hand, you have to be practical. And what is the situation? Well, if we continue doing what we have been doing, we're not only not getting anywhere, but we may even contributing to the problem. So we have to necessarily think some more blunt or some more audacious alternatives for what we're doing. One thing I learned that there is the fiscal component of regularization and dealing with the informal occupation cannot be denied. It cannot be, and this is not in the agenda almost anyway, and it's not so difficult to bring in this to the agenda. So just to give one example of one of the things that, but one thing is for sure that we cannot continue doing the way we're doing with the way we're proceeding, because it's taking us nowhere. So, is that the time for us to be a little bit utopic, to think a little bit, be perhaps a little bit theoretician, or to talk about certain things that were not on the table yet, and perhaps consider other alternatives? I think yes, because we lack of some feasible ideas that would lead us somewhere.
Okay.
I don't know. Sorry if I.
We're actually over time, but what I'd like to try to do, if we can do this quickly, is have one more round of exchanges with the 2 questions and 2 responses. But please, everybody, keep in mind time is a resource. So this gentleman right here.
My name is Michael Donovan. I'm a PhD student at Berkeley. I just had a question about the statute of the city, which is, in my mind, one of the most progressive housing rights laws in the world. And I say that because squatters can get access to adverse possession rights only after 5 years of residence. And I'm wondering, we were talking a lot about models and transplanting models in different countries. I'm wondering if pieces of statute of the city legislation have been transplant in any other country, and what that model looks like. Thank you.
I think that the two main presentations have really been unnecessarily negative. In fact, I think that there is a lot of knowledge out there, but it's just not been assembled well by the academicians, among others. Perhaps this Asian project of the World Bank is going to make a difference, or this individual assertion of what's been happening. I think we would be doing much better with what's happened if we were to be aiming not for a single solution, but if we were to say, look, let's assume that there are something of the order of 5 different kinds of situations, 5 different kinds of access to urban land or productive access to urban land situations. Well, let's categorize them, not now geographically, as someone was suggesting before, but say that they can fit into a number of categories. Let's call them 5. Now, which of those situations that we've seen in the world before correspond to a success or a failure in situation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? With this kind of an approach, I think we will probably have useful material that we can then use in the form of advice to public planners. We may still be quite far from the unified theory that Einstein and others have wanted, but still we may have something which is quite useful for public policy formulation. And frankly, I think it's a failure of the academicians not to have done more of this disaggregation of the results, trying to aggregate everything all together.
Martin?
Okay.
I think this is in your.
We'll let Edicio.
No, just a comment on for those of you who are not familiar with the Statute of the City, this is the Brazilian legal framework which was approved back in 2001 and which has been implemented through local master plans, which are now about 1,300 municipalities in Brazil are now formulating their master plans to materialize the principles and provisions of this national legal framework. And insofar as the matter of informal settlement regularization is concerned, basically the formula proposed by the city statute is that, first of all, the specific policy should be conceived together with the broader set of public policies, land policies, fiscal policies, reinventing the whole discussion on how cities should be financed. I mean, the discussion on land increments and better use of local taxation and all that. There's a strong emphasis on popular participation in the formulation, design, and decision-making process. There's a strong emphasis on the territorial demarcation of these special zones of social interest, and several studies have shown that the mere demarcation of the areas impacts on the formation of land prices, keeps prices low, making it easier for the government to intervene. And in each zone, specific urban planning regulations recognizing that those areas were produced in a different way, so you can't apply to them the same technical criteria that you would apply elsewhere. And insofar as titles are concerned, Brazil has made a very clear decision, which is not the same that we see being applied elsewhere. There's a distinction between settlements on private land and settlements on public land. Insofar as private land is concerned, the emphasis is on adverse possession rights over 5 years. So the role of the judicial power there is very significant to declare people's rights, either individually or collectively. But when settlements are on public land, the option was for a form of leasehold. So the land remains public, and people have the right to stay, to sell, to do whatever they want. But there is this dissociation between the public ownership of the land and the right to occupy the land. So it's a combination of factors there. But again, there's no simple formula. It's a combination of processes, mechanisms, and instruments.
Yeah, the statute, I saw that you were going to comment on the statute of the city has some interesting innovation. One of them is the regularization in collective titling, and that is quite an innovation in the international discussion on that, because that and I think this, I don't know what other places that do that. You probably there's but this is there is another there are a number. I think that the full blown of the statute of the city are still being digged, and people are still. For instance, there is one. If you really take it literally, it would make illegal. Actually, a mayor may be put into jail if he actually gives away building rights without charging for that. No one is actually paying attention to that, but if you read it carefully, this is exactly what it's saying. So, because it equates building rights as a public property. So you cannot give away public property without it's like giving building rights or changing the zoning in certain areas without charging for that would literally mean that you're giving away public property.
Yeah,
so that's pretty interesting, the implications of that.
We are way over
yeah.
time,
Oh, sorry,
and I think we're pushing the patience of the audience. I think if there can be a separate discussion after we break in a moment about the statute in the city of Brazil. I want to try to wrap up the day and give people some ideas of things to think about as they leave the room. I think we actually heard in the last hour perhaps more disagreement than we heard earlier in the day. And what I take away from it is a rather old game of academics pointing at what practitioners are doing and saying, look, you're not really doing anything, and the practitioner is saying, wait a minute, your heads are in the cloud, and look at everything that we've accomplished. There's a point on both sides of that, but I would like to argue, if we go back to where we started this morning, that discussion really misses the point that was put on the table this morning. Going back to Bob Newworth, since we've been sitting here, 750 people have moved from the countryside into the city. 750 people as we have been sitting here. That kind of negates both any successful project that has been implemented in the last 40 years and the kinds of theoretical criticisms that have made some of the policy people in the room bristle. It is clear that informality and informal urban land use is a major and growing problem. You can talk about it as being lose-lose. You can talk about it however you want. This is a very serious problem that has no simple answers. There's no silver bullets, but maybe what I take away from today is there may be a lot of bronze bullets. But those bronze bullets are tied to changing the rules of the game. And this gets back to where Jockin started us off. Changing of the rules of the game are fundamentally about politics. And what we need to think about, indeed, we need to evaluate programs that have worked in the past, and we need to come up with criteria to evaluate those programs. And academics can help do that. But it is the people that Bob talked about and Sheila talked about and Jockin talked about who have the energy to seize their own fate that are going to tell a big part of this story that will have nothing to do with either the academics or the policymakers. And finally, to drive this point home, something Billy Cobbett said this morning, and he always says things that stick in my mind, but it kind of captures it. Ottawa and Lagos were the same size in 1950. The world is changing. It's changing very dramatically, very, very quickly. I mentioned I was just in Kiev. There are some estimates by sociologists that Kiev has grown by over 500,000 people in the last 6-7 years. This is a challenge, and hopefully we'll figure out ways at future seminars for both policymakers and academics to find a way of working and talking about the reality that is on the ground. I want to close by thanking Allison Garland for pulling this together, and Mejgan Masumi who's been wonderful. We have future seminars coming up on transportation, on housing, and on water, and we'll keep you posted. Thank you.
Thank you.